Hello, everybody. Apologies for the delay in getting this recording up to you on loop. I've been quite sick over the past week and wasn't really in a position to even record a lecture, never mind deliver it in person. So my apologies for that, and apologies in advance for any interruptions due to coughing. So on Tuesday, I talked about the topic of science meeting politics. Any questions about that lecture, please get in touch with me, or hopefully I'll be back in action on Tuesday and I'll see you in person. And today our topic is climate change, development and inequality. So just to recap on Tuesday's topic, the arguments there are represented in parallel. On the one hand, we had Pierce et al. In 2017, who was questioning the usefulness of studies that focus on scientific consensus. Hopefully you had a chance to read that article in full, but also the section in the Holm book, I think it's in chapter 9, where you see both arguments laid out side by side. And then Cook, on the other hand, is arguing that pointing out to the public that there is a scientific consensus is an important stepping stone to policy action. And especially because it has been, the perceived lack of consensus has been a key tactic of the fossil fuel industry that have been pushing out misinformation as a tactic to delay action. So today, and I'm going to fly through these slides so we can discuss anything that I skip over too quickly on Tuesday next. We're talking about development and inequality. So this is important because not all countries are at the same level of income. They don't have the same capacity to implement climate policies, and some countries are especially vulnerable to the changes imposed by climate change. So there's great inequality in terms of responsibility for the problem, which is generally a first world issue, and also ability to cope with the problem and ability to adapt and mitigate. In addition, some of the fossil fuel based industries that are really at driving the climate change problem are also partly what has driven economic growth and wealth and development in the West and the global North. And many countries in the global South are afraid that this opportunity will be cut off for them. So we can't consider climate policy and global climate change without looking at issues of development and inequality. So development is very much associated with the concept of modernity, the condition of being modern or up to date. And we associate it with standards of living, having, clothing, education, security, economic opportunities, and of course, shelter. And these aren't to be taken for granted. Many countries in the world have many percentages of their population who don't even have access to electricity. So we are very privileged, we're very lucky. But these privileges are not necessarily available to everybody in the world. So we're looking at a situation where we in the global North have inherited a society and economy that is very much a product of Western European economic development and colonialism since the Enlightenment. We have, in a very roundabout way, benefited from that in Ireland, because obviously we were part of the colonial picture, but not instigators of it for a long time. So development is measured in a number of different ways. In economic terms, you can measure a country's level of development by its GNP per capita, its gross national product per capita. So you're taking the total wealth of the country and dividing it out amongst the number of people in the country. But that doesn't capture very much because, as we all know, economic indicators don't necessarily capture the real world experience of people. So alternative indicators have been developed that tend to be composite indicators, such as the Human Development Index, which captures things like life expectancy at birth, adult literacy rate, enrollment in education, and that kind of thing. And sometimes there is an overlap. For example, Argentina is classified as a middle income country according to its economic income per capita, but with a high level of human development according to the Human Development Index. But you also have some countries where you might have high rates of economic wealth and nonetheless a lower human development index, or at least very high levels of inequality, such as countries in the United States is an example of that. So obviously, when you're looking at development and inequality, we have to consider differences that exist between countries as well as within countries. So within countries, indicators tend to capture a national average, but that doesn't tell you very much about the position of particular social groups, people on particularly low incomes, marginalized groups on grounds of race or ethnicity, or immigrants, for example, or indeed women. And then you've also got inequality in the global north and in the global south, different types of inequality, spatial inequality in terms of the distribution of income, poverty, disadvantage, marginalization. And you've also got other types of inequalities on the grounds of their social group. Women in particular are ethnic groups, and different sort of scenarios exist in different contexts. So dealing with social diversity and defining what's meant by development and how development is implemented, and that's a key part of social policy and developmental policy. But the real issue for us that we're interested in is where there might be tensions between the environment and the idea of development. And obviously there are many particular examples that might come to mind. For example, when the fossil fuel industry, is operating in low-income countries, very often, and this is true of extractive industries as well, like mining and so on, very often the benefits do not accrue to local populations. And those kind of resources are associated with high levels of corruption and high levels of pollution. But unfortunately, it's very difficult for developing countries to access the kind of finance needed to invest in clean technology, such as renewable energy. So in the article, or in the book chapter rather, it's chapter 1 of the Holm book, there's a debate there, highlighting this issue in terms of whether climate change is the most important issue of our times, or whether, in fact, we need to look at that in the context of broader developmental challenges. So Sarah Cornell says yes, because the climate is changing everything. Society's challenges are interconnected and they all play out together in the context of a changing climate. And she makes the case that climate change is affecting the conditions for life on Earth, and that's going to affect everybody. Climate change affects all living beings. It impacts people. It's tightly linked to social change, and it is the significant challenge for our times. But the other author, Gupta, says, no, we can't address climate change without addressing inequality. So climate change is one of the biggest challenges, but inequality is a bigger challenge. Framing climate change as the crisis or emergency can be damaging. Because growing inequality is the greatest challenge of our times. And if we tell people that it's not inequality, it's climate change, that conflicts with people's lived experience. Without addressing inequality, we cannot reach an effective or fair response to climate change. Furthermore, an emergency or crisis framing of climate change and the measures that can be justified with that framing. In other words, you're willing to give the government even more power and give it more power to force people to do things and force changes to the way people live, might present a risk to, people's human rights, their distributive justice considerations, democracy and democratic decision-making, And it also means that governments could experiment in controversial technical fixes, geoengineering and other types of things. So that kind of way of thinking about it as an emergency or a crisis, it tends to concentrate power in the hands of a small group of people. And number 4, climate change and inequality need to be addressed together. You can't really separate them, but at the same time, you can't privilege one topic over another. And finally, there's a risk of creating a post-political, post-equity and post-democratic world. So, like, where is this all leading to? Are we trying to create, a new set of problems by responding to climate change? Or is it a lens through which we should be attempting to resolve existing challenges? So actually next week we're not going to have Diarmuid Tourney. That's an out-of-date slide, so I apologise for leaving that there. But we will be talking about the most recent COP, which was in not Sharm el-Sheikh, it was in the United Arab Emirates in Dubai, and that would have been COP28. So we will be looking at that next week alongside the history of the UNFCCC negotiations. So just to recap as well, that I'm going to put the questions for the essay on a Word document separately in Loop so you can see them clearly. And please bring up any questions you have about those when we are in class next week.